Postmodernism is still a little strong, but not so strong. We will finish in Germany, where the postmodern, we can say, was born. Now I call De Caro for the interview. De Caro is professor in the University of Roma 3. They will discuss with one of the most important world philosophers, Hilary Putnam, professor at Harvard.
Hilary, can you hear me?
Hi, Mario. Don't worry.
Okay.
You'll get an answer. Take it easy.
Hilary Putnam cannot be here today because he's just back from Europe, from Sweden, where he got the Rolf Schock Prize, that is like the Nobel Prize for philosophers, and he's back from there after a long trip. So we prefer to set this Skype discussion that I think will work. So, as Riccardo Viale was saying, in Italy and Europe there is a big discussion now, and finally it seems that people have realized that realism is the right philosophical approach, and postmodernism is really hasn't many followers anymore. But the point is, which realism also? So we asked Hilary Putnam, that probably is the leading philosopher, and certainly is the philosopher who has done the most in discussing realism in the last 50 years. So, as many people know, Hilary has defended different versions of realism. All his career has been attempt to shape the right form of realism. And just to summarize, I say that in his career there are three main versions of realism that he has tried to shape. The first one is metaphysical realism, that Hilary has defended between the mid-50s up to 1976. And this is the idea, more or less, that truth is radically non-epistemic. So this means that even in ideal theory, so a theory that is formulated and verified in ideal epistemic conditions, might be false. So reality overcomes knowability. And the second idea is that reality is composed by exactly one domain of individuals and one domain of properties attributed to those individuals. So one realities. Really, there is no pluralism in any way. In 76, famously, Hilary gave up internal metaphysical realism and started to defend a new version of realism called internal realism, that is a form of verificationism, vaguely Kantian in the spirit, and this is based on an epistemic conception of truth. So the idea that truth depends on knowability. And from this point of view that Hilary adopted in the mid-70s, metaphysical realism is incoherent. It's not just that it is wrong. Hilary at that point thought that metaphysical realism is coherent. Nowadays, Hilary has changed his view, and he has defends a new version of realism that perhaps we could say intermediate between these two extremes. On the one side, it doesn't believe that reality is composed by only one domain of individuals and properties, but on the other side, doesn't think that truth depends on knowability. Moreover, it thinks that metaphysical realism is not incoherent, it's just false. That's progress. And another thing is that internal realism had very bad consequences. It leads to solipsism and even is incompatible with semantic externalism. That's one of Hilary's main views. So, Hilary, can you say more about your own present views on realism now?
Yes. Well, I think I'm trying to produce something which we might call either naive realism or sophisticated realism, because I think what we really need is, because sophistication, I think, about realism also requires recognizing that there is some truth in naive realism, but at the same time, without going all the way to what I would call ultra-naive realism. The ultra-naive realism, I would say, Well, the most ultra-naive realist philosopher I think I know is Mike Martin at the University of London. I mean, for Mike Martin, his example in one of his papers, the name is escaping me at the moment, but he used the example of seeing a white picket fence. It makes it clear that when my experience is veridical, of course, he is what is called a disjunctivist, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but when my perception is veridical, that's to say, there really is a white picket fence there, and I'm not subject to any illusion, then the phenomenal quality of my experience, the phenomenal character of my experience, is identical with the observable properties of the fence. That is to say, the whiteness, to use Russell's language in Problems of Philosophy, the white that I see, contrary to Russell, because that was what he was attacking in Problems of Philosophy, contrary to Russell, the white that I see when I look at the fence is on the fence, not in my head, in my mind, in my brain. So this of course is the, at least as far as observable things are concerned. We'll talk in a few minutes about unobservable things like genes, atoms, and so on. But as far as observable things are concerned, Martin's is the most extreme form of realism possible. It would be nice if it were true, right? That's why we call it. But what it leaves out is what John Dewey would have called the transactional nature of experience. That experience, the phenomenal qualities that we experience are not just a function of the properties of the things we see. Confine ourselves for a moment to visual experience, because by far the huge majority of the discussion, perhaps unfortunately, is about vision. But the qualities of our visual experience depend both on the properties of the perceiver, which should be obvious, and the properties of the things seen. Some so-called intentionalists in the philosophy of perception, like Michael Tye, come very close to Martin's view. I mean, the properties that our experience presents or seems to present, according to the intentionalists, are real physical properties, and the character of those physical properties is what determines the property of the experience. In my own, I know that that's false for my own case, because something I observed already when I was in my 20s, but you would observe for yourself, is if you look at a fairly, it's easiest to do this, look at a scene. It can be if just a few feet away, it's many feet away. Look at, say, a white wall or a sandy beach. Close one eye and then close the other, and ask yourself whether the color that you see is exactly the same, whether the phenomenal character, rather, of the color you see is exactly the same when viewed through the left eye and viewed through the right eye. So far, 100% of the people who've tried this, but let's say it's only 99%, say yes, there's a difference. I mean, the maculae of the two eyes are not identical, for one thing. And there isn't and it's not a matter of some people having abnormal maculae. It's not a matter of the left eyes are, everybody's left eye has a normal macula, and the right eye has a abnormal macula. The phenomenal quality, this is something that Ned Block has had a great influence on me about. He will be at a conference later today speaking. The phenomenal qualities are not simply a matter of the external world. But that doesn't mean we have to go as Russell's conclusion in Problems of Philosophy. And he was perhaps the first to notice this, there's no such thing as the appearance of the color of the table, or to use the table as example. As you walk around the table, different parts of it, the phenomenal character of the color of the tabletop will change. Parts that are in glare will be almost white, and so on. Russell's conclusion, however, was the color I see is in a private space. And the colors the roughness I feel is in a private space. The noises I hear are in a private space. So Russell did not want to end up with solipsism. We can see why his student Wittgenstein felt the great solipsism is such a great problem in the Tractatus. He tries to dissolve it, say it's a pseudo-problem. Realism and solipsism end up being the same thing. And I'm not going to try to explain what I think he meant by that. But you can see here right at the beginning of modern analytic philosophy, because in a way the problems of philosophy in 1912 is almost the beginning of analytic philosophy. Frege's meaning and Sinn und Bedeutung, sense and references earlier, but really, many ways analytic philosophy, as we know it, gets going with these two sources, Frege and Russell. And at the very beginning, this problem is realism inside, is the reality inside us, or do we really have contact with the reality outside of ourselves is there? And I would say I'm trying to produce something which is in between in your sense, in that it says, yes, we are in contact with properties of the table, in Russell's case, of Martin's picket fence. We are in contact with real properties, but those properties are in part anthropocentric.
Hilary, one thing that you have discussed, your present version of realism, and you have changed your mind on several issues, and now you regard your previous views of internal realism as a form of anti-realism. But one thing on which you haven't ever, I think, if I understand, changed your mind is scientific realism. That's particularly interesting here because some people still think and argue that science is just an instrument or a set of conventions, or it's not really picking up properties in the world and blah blah blah. If I understand, you always subscribe to these two theories, that the theoretical terms of science, of mature science at least, refer to real entities like atoms or electrons. We have all reason to think that these terms refer to real entities. And second, you have argued that if science wasn't really describing the world, it would be a miracle that it works so well in predictions, explanations, and so on. That's the famous no miracles argument. Many people have objected this doesn't work. The idea, I repeat, the no miracles argument is that we know that science works so well in predicting things. So, for example, Einstein's theory of relativity. But still, some people say, okay, could be a good, good instrument, but why should we say that it describes reality? You have this argument that otherwise would be a miracle. So, could you say a little more about this?
Yep. Yeah, I still think that. I found Jacques Derrida to be a very likable person. And certainly if he was a postmodern, if anyone was, but he flew in airplanes all the time.
Yes.
He clearly had no doubt that those airplanes would fly, and if one of the designers got a law of physics wrong, he and all of us who fly around a lot would have been in real trouble. I still think to say that, but let me say a little more about that. Then maybe we can come back to the tables and chairs case too. But on scientific objects, to say that science gets reality right is not to say it gets it completely right, because scientists are aware that their theories are, especially in fundamental physics, which is perhaps the most exciting field in pure theoretical science there is, because it puts us in touch when people can say, well, we can tell you what the universe was like, when 300,000 years after it began, we can go, the universe is 9 billion years old, not 6,000 years old as people thought, when the access we now have to the early universe and to events hundreds of thousands of light years away. 1987, a supernova that was observed in 1987, it was 700,000 light years away. And of course, the fact that the neutron burst from that supernova arrived at the same time as the photons shows that whatever happened in that anomalous result in CERN, it's not that neutrons normally travel faster than light. Mm-hmm. Those neutrons traveled 700,000 years, and they did not travel faster than the light. They arrived a day or two later. So obviously this is an enormous excitement, but at the same time, for example, the Hadron Collider at CERN has failed to detect something called the Higgs boson. string theorists are beginning to just think maybe the Higgs boson is not there. Now, it's called the standard model in quantum electron dynamics, rests heavily on the prediction of the Higgs boson. Neither has it detected any evidence of supersymmetry. If this keeps up, obviously it will turn out that a great deal of particle physics will have to be rethought. But nevertheless, no one doubts that quantum mechanics is approximately true. I know there are philosophers and logicians who say, well, there's no mathematically precise definition of approximate truth. That's right. But I think it's an indispensable concept. To be a realist, to be a sane realist, you have to think there's something to the notion of approximate truth. Very often what that comes to, for example, in what sense was Newton's theory of gravity approximately true? There's a sense in which it was radically wrong, in the sense that gravitation, if Einstein is right, and he keeps looking better and better, pace what happened at CERN, if Einstein is right, then gravitation is not a force in the usual sense. Gravitation is an effect of the curvature of space itself, space-time itself. Nevertheless, does that affect, if you express Einstein's law of gravity as a differential equation, so-called, what you find is that equation remains approximately true in Einstein's theory. It may be the sense in which scientific theories at the most fundamental level are approximately is often almost a purely mathematical sense. What seems to converge is that the equations get better and better. It's an open question whether there's such a thing as a final ontology to which physics converges, or only, so to speak, a final structural description. But that there's something right about physics. I say otherwise, it really is a miracle that these beautiful mathematical formulas predict exactly what such very different things, both very large things and very small things, do.
Okay, Hilary, thank you. And your next collection of essays that coming out from Harvard is called Philosophy in an Age of Science. This seems to be one of your main concerns. What's the place of philosophy in a world that is, as you said, described precisely as to the physical components by science? So your point is that there are many cognitively non-equivalent and also mutually irreducible ways of describing reality. So a chair can be described usefully and truthfully with the language of physics, but also with the language of carpentry or furniture design and so on. Yes. All these descriptions can be true, they don't contradict each other, but also you say something that is interesting to discuss, for example, for a minute. So you think that the properties of a higher level tend to supervene on the properties of the lower level, the physical level. So the notion here is supervenience. For people who don't know what this is, Ned Bullock just arrived, Hilary. Ned, you have been mentioned several times. So the idea is that if we have two exactly identical physical universes, the other properties cannot really be different. So for example, let's look at the mental properties. Mental properties in your view globally supervene on physical properties. So this means that in two physically identical universes, me and my counterpart have to have identical mental properties. Now, some people, including Akhil Bigrami, who's here, and Stephen White, don't agree with the idea of global supervenience. They have several arguments. I'm interested in your reply to this one. This is an argument. So global supervenience seems to be too weak a relation, and what really would be required here is relevant supervenience. Let me explain. Because global supervenience seems to be compatible with the possibility that two possible worlds exist, in which I and my counterpart differ in only one mental property, and the two worlds also differ in some physical property, so global supervenience is in place, but those physical differences are obviously irrelevant. For example, in these two universes, there is a tiny physical difference between some remote asteroid in our world and the counterpart asteroid in the other world. Obviously, the two physical differences, this physical difference is irrelevant as to the mental difference. Still, the requirement for global supervenience seems to be fulfilled. So it seems that global supervenience as such is not enough to capture the relation between the mental and the physical world. You need something like relevant supervenience, but then the notion of relevance, as you have proved and shown many times, cannot be determined a priori, and seems to add something to the issue of supervenience. So what do you think of this? This is one of the many attacks on the notion of global supervenience here.
The fact that something doesn't give you everything you want doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, very odd to move from global supervenience is a very weak claim, which doesn't speak to many philosophical problems, to it doesn't exist. In fact, global supervenience is already relevant because many classical positions about mind and life were incompatible with this very weak relation of global supervenience. The Cartesian interactionism is incompatible with global supervenience.
So your point,
and so I would say it is, and moreover, the forms of the term emergence has come back. I've noticed happily that scientists are beginning to talk about emergence. I was at a meeting of the American Philosophical Society, which is not a philosophical organization. It's America's oldest learned society, 40% of whose members are Nobel Prize winners, by the way. And I was at a symposium at the American Philosophical Society a few years ago, at which scientists were using the terms emergence all over the place in connection with hydrodynamics, but they didn't mean, by emergence, they didn't mean a kind of emergence that violates global supervenience. They simply meant that the properties at higher levels, can be different in ways that we cannot, at least feasibly, deduce from the lower levels, but not that they violate the laws at the lower levels. So I think, first of all, to say that because global supervenience doesn't tell you what the relevant relations are between mental states and brain states, so let's forget about it. When we consider how many debates there were through the centuries about interactionism and vitalism and emergence and so on, I think it's important to not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It took us a long time to arrive at global supervenience. And if it now seems, Schopenhauer said that there's only it seems as if there's only a few seconds between the time when an idea is dismissed as too radical to be true and the time when it's dismissed as obvious.
Thank you.
And so I was, now we've reached the stage when global supervenience is obvious. Who cares about that? Well, that's historically insensitive.
Okay, thank you. Last question before asking the audience if they have questions. On some issues, you tend to defend a form of semantic realism without endorsing ontological realism. And this is mathematics and ethics in particular. So you defend a view that you have called objectivity without objects. So, for example, moral statements are not just truth apt, like in Mackey, but John Mackey thinks that moral claims pretend to be true, but they are always false. For you, moral statements can also be true, and also you think at the same time that no moral entities exist to which moral statements refer. So you have objectivity or moral statements without having objective moral properties as such. So there is not goodness out there, so to make it. So can you articulate this a little more? This is very original. So can you, for mathematics also. So,
okay, first I have to correct that. There are moral entities. For example, there are moral people.
Yeah, not specifically moral.
I'm not saying there's no ontology, that ethical sentences don't have an ontology. If I see I saw that man steal her purse, right? The man exists, and if you believe in events, the event of stealing the purse exists. In fact, Morton White, many years ago, said that, one problem with the positivist dismissal of ethical claims as non-cognitive is that they couldn't really explain why steal isn't an observation term. I saw him steal her purse and observation sentence. They had, in fact, they could only rule it out by having a list of observation terms. And say, oh yes, well, steal isn't in our list. That Morton White was the first to claim that the fact-value dichotomy is in exactly as bad shape as the analytic-synthetic dichotomy. And that once you give up the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, the fact-value dichotomy doesn't have a last. What I deny is not that there are moral terms, that there are things to which moral terms refer, such as people and events. I deny that we need to postulate invisible entities undetectable by science or common or ordinary people to account for ethics. In particular, we don't have to reify values. Which isn't to say, but nevertheless, I would say, if you ask, so what the objectivity of ethics rests on, I would say it rests on the fact that ethics answers real human needs. And I am willing to quantify over needs.
Okay.
In other words, I am against inflationary ontology, which postulates mysterious things that cannot be verified either by common sense observation or scientific observation. I don't...
Yes. So you also applied this to mathematical talk, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly
Yeah, I'm what is called a modal structuralist about mathematics. It seems to me that what has been called Benacer's problem, which is how, given that mathematical objects are not supposed to be things with which we can interact in any way, so how can it be that a term like 1 or 5 determinately refers?
Sure.
And so, but I think even the way children learn arithmetic is by, or the way we teach children arithmetic is by appealing what I would call a modal intuition. The child, I remember there was the son of friends of mine in Israel. In fact, he's the son of Yirmiyahu Yovel, an Israel Prize winner and a famous philosopher. His son, when he was small, one day, so I said, there are more numbers than the stars.
That's possible.
Now, he had tumbled to really the idea you can always go on counting. Children 4 or 5 suddenly realize you can always go on counting. Now, Wittgenstein dismisses that in various places. He says, well, it just means that we won't bother about an end. That's nonsense. The child really has the idea that you could always go on counting. But what's interesting is that you could always is not a physical you could always. Child knows that you can't really always go on counting. I would say the idea, there's other modality, the mathematical modality, the mathematical sense of you could, it's possible that. Or it's possible that to make an equilateral triangle, it's not possible to trisect an angle. This is possible. I would say that I see the objectivity of mathematics as the objectivity of the mathematical senses of it's possible and it's necessary. Now again, that is, I'm prepared to be proved wrong, but that is, I think, the most reasonable metaphysical view of the objectivity of mathematics.
Thank you. We still have 2 minutes, Hilary. Why philosophy in the age of science, then?
Because we are reflective beings. I mean, Plato got it right. Remember, according to Vlastos, Plato took 10 years off to study mathematics, according to Gregory Vlastos. Certainly, philosophy can go with, and should go with, enormous respect for science. But philosophy speculates, reasons, evaluates arguments beyond what science can reach. It takes risks in doing that, enormous risks. But that is a part of a deep part of humanity, and a particular analytic inflection of that is a very central part of Western culture, I think.
Thank you, Hilary. So let's thank you for the talk. 15 minutes. Now we have some time for some questions for the audience. It's a little complicated because people have to move here, but who wants to say?
Is this on a screen, by the way? Could people see me?
They will come here. No, they have to come here because Hilary has to see them. Yeah. So yep. Yeah, come here, please. Okay. Say your name. And
Puts me on the spot.
yeah, you have.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
nice to see you.
I'm David Andrew Jones. I'm professor of French at Queen's College and the Graduate Center of CUNY. And I just have a question for you about Derrida and postmodernism. If we think about the sort of iconic postmodernist, it would be Derrida, and you brought him up in your talk, and I'm glad that you did. And I just wondered if you could talk about a possible rapprochement, to use a French term, between his notion of différance, which is deferral, and difference, and this notion of approximate truth. You mentioned that Derrida flew in airplanes all the time, and Derrida, as you know, was someone who wrote against the sort of Hegelian notion of absolute truth. But I wonder, and you talked about particle physics and the need to sort of constantly revise what is the truth of particle physics, and it struck me that it is very much in the vein of Derrida's notion of différance, that the absolute truth of particle physics is constantly deferred and constantly put off into the future. So I wonder if you could discuss how postmodernism might, in fact, inform your current thinking. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm actually glad that Derrida did not choose to write about science very much, because he was modest about his knowledge of science, rightly so, which some postmoderns were not. But look, physics has not arrived at anything like an absolute truth. That's true. But there's no philosophical proof that it can't. I mean, it's not a question for philosophy. It may well be that the most we can get in physics ever is approximate truth. But it also may be that, at least at the level of fundamental physics, some equation we arrive at holds without exception. I don't see that theoretical philosophy can say anything about that question. Secondly, there are times, my view of I spell out my view of where Derrida goes wrong in more detail in a chapter about Derrida and Nelson Goodman in one of my volumes. I think it's in Renewing Philosophy. Goodman, by the way, was very happy to be coupled with Derrida. He was delighted. But it seems to me that Derrida's view of truth amounts to, on the one hand, Derrida recognized that it's a fact about us, an anthropological fact that we can't do without the notion of truth. But the tone seems to me one of regret. We may just disagree on how we interpret Derrida, and of course, one can always interpret a philosopher one loves so he comes out right, but I'm not going to play that game.
Okay, now there is Marcus Gabriel at University of Bonn.
Yeah, hey, can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you see?
I would like to take the opportunity to ask you a question about the proper objectivity of ontology. I mean, does what you said also apply to ontology? At some point in ethics, without ontology, of course, seem to be endorsing a kind of ontological anti-realism when you consider some variety of what is nowadays called quantifier variance. And you say that the quantifiers might not have a single use, but as you put it, a whole family of uses, which are determined as a matter of convention. Now, I'm just wondering what your take on this currently is. That's one question. And the other question is, do you see a similarity, even a deep similarity, between the disjunctivism debate about perception that you mentioned and a possibility for talking about the objectivity of values or, say, mathematical propositions? Because, when you did I see the color C with my left eye and color shade C star with my right eye, do you think that there's some similarity, say, between the Fregean notion of sense and this kind of observation, such that you could have a similarity between the mathematical case and the perception case? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. The first, before I forget, the first question again. Remind me of the first question.
Okay. The question of ontological anti-realism and quantifier variance. What's your view on that?
I don't. Well, I think that the quantifiers we use always obey certain formal laws. But already Quine was prepared to admit a certain amount of quantifier variance because he recognizes two kinds of quantification: substitutional and objectual. So I think in general, take the notion of truth, for example. As this, I think, is a more useful comparison. True always obeys, at least when we formalize, and I agree this is somewhat of an idealization, but I think idealization is legitimate, formalization is legitimate, and at least when we formalize, we can say that true, all the uses of true obey the disquotation property. But it doesn't follow that all there is to truth is disquotation. That seems to be a huge error. The Tarski, I think, was discovered. I mean, sure, the discovery was anticipated, but in a large way, discovered or almost discovered two important properties of the notion of truth, which had gone really neglected, for strange as it may seem, for millennia. The Wahrheitsbegriff, the paper, the famous Tarski paper, when she first works out the semantical conception of truth, remember, uses two properties of truth, which has confused the debate ever since, but they're both properties of the notion. One is that truth is definable in terms of reference. I don't know whether, probably you can find that in Frege too somewhere, but it's certainly not something I associate with Frege, as far as I know, and I think Tarski himself messes it up somewhere. I've criticized Tarski in various places, but nevertheless, although I think the criticisms are right, it's also right, and this is what Hartley Field pointed out in a famous paper in the 70s on Tarski's criterion of truth. You can reformulate Tarski so that what he's doing in such a way that you see that part of what Tarski did was to show that the predicate true is definable in terms of the relation refers to, or Tarski's technical substitute for refers to. That definability of truth in terms of reference is radically, I think, new in the history of philosophy. But at the same time, Tarski's criterion of adequacy obviously rests on the disquotational property. And I think the whole story is that truth about empirical matters does depend on reference. And that's something that even that Frege also mentions, as Charles Travis has pointed out to me, at least in a letter he found. Truth about empirical matters depends on reference. What the truth condition for that rabbit is eating my roses, I guess they don't eat roses, but they certainly eat my tulips. That rabbit is eating my tulips depends on the denotation, the reference of the extension of the terms rabbit and tulip. When it comes to pure mathematics, I've argued that the notion of reference seems to be more of a formal notion. It's not that there are really objects there, mathematical objects there, but disquotation is preserved. It seems to me, is it true, here's a cup in my hand. Is it true that this cup weighs, let's say, 10 ounces? Well, it might be true if I'm buying it in a pottery shop, and it might be false if it's being measured in a physics lab. What the truth or falsity depends on its context-sensitive criteria for reference. 10 ounces, what we call 10 ounces in a shop, we would not call 10 ounces in a physics lab. So I would say that in this case, the disquotational property seems to be the property that truth has in all the language games in which we use it. But it has additional properties in particular language games. I think ontology is like that as well.
Okay. Hilary, thank you very much. That was great. And perhaps you said that you are interested in following the day and perhaps asking some questions to Umberto Eco. We'll see. You and I can have an update during the coffee break here through Skype. You can be connected, but you and I will talk at 11:30 during the
11:30, okay, because I have things I have to do today. I'll check in at 11:30.
Okay. Thank you. Bye. Okay.